Welcome to Cradle and All, a podcast hosted by sisters Renita and Christine to educate, inspire, and connect with other mothers. Every other week, listen as we discuss topics related to pregnancy, raising children, and balancing motherhood with other aspects of womanhood. Whether you're relaxing, juggling tasks, or even breast pumping, join us as we figure it out together. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Cradle and All. This is your host, Renita.
And this is Christine. Thank you so much for joining, or if it's your very first time, welcome. We're so glad that you found us for this very important and informative episode today.
So this week we wanted to talk about something that can be tough for women to talk about, but we'd like to talk about miscarriage. You know, when I have patients in my office, it is a time where people can talk about things that they may not talk about with others. And many times when women are going through miscarriage, they tend to go through it alone or just with their support person or partner with them, but don't really talk to other women about it. Some of that's because, you know, they are disappointed and don't want to spread that disappointment to others. Sometimes it's because you haven't even told people you were pregnant, so don't want to advertise it. But sometimes it's because you feel like no one would understand, or you haven't gone through, they haven't gone through it before. So we felt like it was important to bring this to the forefront so we can just have a conversation about something that a lot of women go through and just how to handle it or how to support those who've gone through it.
Right. Yes. And I know I've personally experienced a miscarriage, and I'm looking forward to sharing that story during our conversation today, because like Renita was saying, it can be very isolating and you can feel like you're going through it alone. I know I did. And so just having a conversation, hearing somebody else's experience, I know would have been very, very helpful when I was going through it. So before I share my experience, I think it's important for us to understand, just from a medical perspective, what a miscarriage is and a early pregnancy loss. And so, Renita, I want to hear from you about just different things around miscarriage. It can be different topics around miscarriages, because it can be so confusing and like unclear. At least that's how I felt. I was like, what? Wait a minute. I didn't even. So, I mean, what constitutes a miscarriage?
Yeah, absolutely. And it can really be confusing because it can be something that you experience at the time of symptoms, and sometimes it could be based on a diagnosis in the office. But basically, a miscarriage is when the pregnancy doesn't progress anymore. It's stopped moving forward and ultimately will come to an end. And so many times when a miscarriage is happening, the brain is just now reaching the signal that the pregnancy is not working and that it's over, but the development may have stopped weeks before. So you can know you're having a miscarriage because you are having bleeding and you're starting to look like what's becoming a period, or sometimes you may go to the doctor and on ultrasound be told that things are not progressing. But typically, the most common cause of a miscarriage is because the DNA, when sperm and egg come together, the DNA just is not exactly perfect how it's supposed to be, and the body can basically reset. And that's the most common cause of a miscarriage. So nothing that a person does. You can go bungee jumping and skydiving and do all kinds of activities, and none of those things typically would cause a miscarriage. It's usually out of your control.
Wow. So much there to unpack, because I mean, you said so many things. So one about the body, like your body recognizing that the pregnancy is not viable. That I want to dive into, as well as what you shared about the pregnancy, like the genetic materials didn't form properly. Because I remember with me, I was thinking I was pregnant over the holidays. And so I found out in January after the holidays that the pregnancy loss happened weeks before I even knew it was happening, which I thought was so strange. I was like, so you're telling me I had a non-living being inside of me for several weeks? And I was like, well, why am I just now finding this out? Like, we were thinking everything was fine. We were thinking like just planning for the future. And then we go to the doctor and they say, oh yeah, the baby's measuring this size. And I'm like, what? But we were just celebrating. So that is very interesting to me, like the delay between the what's happening inside and then when you actually realize that the pregnancy is no longer viable.
That can be, as you know, sometimes some of the hardest things because trying to wrap your head around what you are seeing and feeling with your body, like you may still have nausea or breast tenderness, you're not bleeding yet for some women, but then an ultrasound's done and then somebody's telling you, oh, wait, this is a miscarriage. Things are not progressing. There's no heartbeat. So it's hard to reconcile that. And that's one of the hardest things about this kind of diagnosis.
Right. And then you also said what I wanted to dive into as well was about the genetic material. Basically, I'm summarizing here that something was wrong with the sperm and the egg. Does that mean that the baby or the embryo, or whatever you want to call it, was going to be like have a disability or that does that mean that something actually was physically or something was wrong? Is that always the case?
So really, that's a way to think about it. So there are some medical conditions where people may not have the perfect, quote unquote, perfect DNA, but that is still a viable pregnancy. Life can still come from it. So you can think of conditions like Down syndrome. That is one of the most common types of conditions that are based in something going on with the DNA, where the DNA is not perfect. Instead of having 46 chromosomes, which is kind of like DNA tissue, there is an extra bit of DNA tissue there, but that child can still live. But there are certain syndromes or certain kind of characteristics that may be associated with that condition. Similarly, when miscarriages happen, again, there are multiple reasons for miscarriages, but when it comes to miscarriages that are due to something going on with the DNA, this tends to be due to non-viable causes of it leading to a miscarriage. So whatever happens with the DNA, it's not perfect and it's not able to progress into life. It's not going to work where a child can be born from it. So the body recognizes that and then things reset and it leads to a miscarriage. So there are some, and baby may be born with some kind of conditions, but still can live. But most of the time when a miscarriage happens, it's not viable, meaning that the baby was never going to live.
Yeah, that is just really hard to reconcile with, because I know for me, it was like trying to figure out, well, what went wrong? Is it something that, of course, not blaming myself. Like you said, it's nothing that the woman can do, even though everyone does not know that and believe that. I remember hearing from a family member saying, oh, well, you should have just, whatever. You should have probably just relaxed more. And I was like, I had to tell this person, that's not true. That would not have changed anything. But I don't think that everyone understands that.
It's hard for even women or men. It's hard for partners who are going through this to understand that maybe I didn't do anything, but I really want people out there to know that it's not anything that you're doing, because sometimes you can think back and be like, well, maybe if I did just do that one thing differently, or if I hadn't have, gone on that trip or taken that, medicine, but really most of the time that's not the case.
Yeah. And that's very important to know.
So now there can be some other types of, causes for miscarriage. As I mentioned, usually something with the DNA is the most common type, but there can be other types. Like sometimes infection can be a cause. So if you get a certain type of infection that leads to significant fever, or, it can be severe enough, then that in itself may lead to miscarriage. Or certain kind of, toxins or certain kind of medications that may be unhealthy toward the pregnancy can sometimes lead to miscarriage as well. But those things are not as common as, issues with DNA.
Okay.
Now for you, when you found out that you were pregnant, and then eventually found out that it was a miscarriage, how much time had gone by before you found out, and how did you find out?
So when I did miscarry, it was for my very first appointment. Like when you get pregnant, they tell you have to come in after like 7 weeks, right? Something like that. 7 weeks. So it was around that time when I was going to go in. So let me think about this actually. No, I went in for my 7 week and then you go back, what, a month later at that point?
Yep.
Okay. So I had already gone in for my 7 weeks. So I was going to go in for, it was when I was going in for my, the next month. So what is that? 12 weeks? About 12 weeks. So when I went in, I was about 11 weeks in my mind, but the baby was only measuring 9 weeks. So when I was going to the doctor, I had an appointment that same week for a scheduled appointment for the regular monthly appointment. But the week that I was supposed to be going, I noticed bleeding. And so when I noticed that, of course, any pregnant woman, when you see bleeding, like alarm bells raise, unless it's something that you experience in pregnancy. So when I noticed the bleeding, I was like, oh my God, Dontrell, look. And I was like, I think I even called you. I was like, I'm sure I did. I was like, okay, bleeding. You're like, well, just give it time, see if there's any more. And then if there's more, we'll just deal with it when that happens. So
now, was it like bright red or was it brown? Like, did it look like a period?
It was bright red. I think the first time I noticed it, like the very first spotting, it was not as bright. But then as it continued, it got brighter and brighter. And honestly, I did not really start bleeding a lot until after I went to the doctor and like they confirmed it. I don't know if like your mind and body have to be in sync and like you accept it. But for me, I didn't really have heavy bleeding until after the doctor like confirmed that it was a miscarriage. But before that, it was enough to be alarming, and it was a brighter color. It wasn't like as much as like period blood, but it was enough to be like, okay, I'm pregnant. Why is there any blood at all?
Now, at this time, were you still getting pregnancy symptoms, or did you even have any pregnancy symptoms at all?
I did. So I still was having the tender breast. That was my main symptom back then. That was it. And so I was still having that. And I felt like, because I also was doing my own Google research and figuring out like what it all means, but I still had symptoms. Well, that one symptom. So I was like, okay, everything was okay. But I think in my mind, you start to second guess, and you really I started to just think of the worst possible thing. But yeah, I was having the symptoms, and I was thinking, and something that actually I think was a little misleading to me was what they say about the heartbeat. So when I went to the 7-week appointment, they said, oh, there's a heartbeat. And we saw the heartbeat. We're like, oh, okay. And then they say that if you see the heartbeat, you're less likely, like you're 80% less likely to have a miscarriage. I feel like that's a medical thing that y'all say. Is that actually true?
Well,
it's not like, what is the percentage?
Well, we know that miscarriages are most likely to happen in the first trimester, and definitely if it's going to happen, going to most likely happen at less than 10 weeks. You usually start to see the heartbeat around 6 weeks. So usually by the time you've gotten that far, then your chances of miscarriages does drop, but that does not drop to 0. So that's where you may hear that, and that by the time you see the heartbeat, your chances are a little bit better. But I always like to remind patients that ultrasound is basically a snapshot in time. It doesn't tell me what things look like before, and it doesn't tell me what things are going to look like in the future. So it doesn't really mean that, things are going to move exactly forward how you expect it to. But your risk of miscarriage does go down after that heartbeat is seen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that was I felt reassured by that. And now I wish I never did, because I was like completely shocked when they're like, oh, yes, we can't find a heartbeat. I'm like, wait a minute. I thought that we were out of the woods. But so anyway, let me start at the beginning of my experience, because when I had this pregnancy, this was when it was back in 2016, and we weren't trying to get pregnant. But we were actually excited about the pregnancy, because me and my then boyfriend, now husband, we knew we were going to be together. We knew we had a future together. So we were excited to be parents. I think he always wanted to be a parent. So did I. So even though we were not in like a stable place, we were like, this is going to be great. So I was not expecting to be pregnant. I think I shared this in another episode about like how I found out I was pregnant. I had symptoms. I was like, oh wait, my boobs are sore. My period's late. Wait a minute. I think I'm pregnant. And I was. So, we were very excited. We told our family, everybody was excited. We were so nervous. I remember telling you guys on
Oh, it was so
Thanksgiving.
cute how y'all told us.
It was cute. We put a little pregnancy test in a box and like hid it under, we put a box under everyone's chair. We're like, somebody has a gift in their box. And then the person who had it was my dad, but everyone opened their box to see what was inside. And my dad's like, this is a pregnancy test. I saw this on Love and Hip.
Oh my God. Okay, this is a diversion from this conversation, but I just want to put out there. Remember when Dad was like, right before you had him open the gift, he said he had a dream about, was it me being pregnant?
Yes.
Like he had a dream about pregnancy.
Yes, he did. I was like, oh my God, wrong person. But yeah, he did say that. So that was a very fun time. We were so nervous because we're like, okay, we're not ready. We were adults, of course. We were like in our full blown adults, but we were still nervous, Dontrell and I. So once everything was out in the open, we were looking forward to the pregnancy. And so life carried on. We started making plans for the future. I was going to move in, all of that. But then I remember even when we had the first ultrasound, because of course you are a doctor, I think we had the ultrasound like around the holidays. We went to your office.
Oh yeah, I did it.
Yes. You did. So we got the images. We were so excited. We started thinking about names. We named the baby and all of that. And mind you, this was like the first couple of weeks. So then around the holidays, things were moving along. We're planning for the future. Dontrell proposes. We were like really excited for the future. And then I start noticing the spotting. And like I said, it was just very nerve-wracking because I mean, I was always told that you don't really bleed one thing you can expect when you're pregnant is to have no period. So you're excited that you get to miss out on that part of being a woman. And so I was very nervous when I noticed that because I know my mom experienced some spotting and stuff during pregnancy, and you did too. Mm-hmm. But this was a little different. So we were so nervous. We went to the hospital, just really nervous because we just felt like something was off. And they do the ultrasound. And I mean, you're just sitting there like holding your breath, looking. Dontrell and I were there in the room together, just holding our breath. And then the physician's assistant said, yeah, I don't see basically like we don't see a heartbeat. And our hearts just drop. We're just like, oh my gosh, like all this anticipation and joy for the future just suddenly stops. And I mean, we literally she gave us a minute and we like start crying in the room because we were just so disappointed. You know, we were just so excited to be parents. We named the baby. We were thinking about our future. And then it just like all comes crashing down. And it was just so disappointing. But I'm so grateful that Dontrell and I had each other to experience it, to like just be there for each other because it was difficult. And so, I mean, from there, now they were talking about like, okay, so, and it's kind of very abrupt, like, so how do you want to get the baby out? Which I think you can probably talk to also, Renita, about like the different ways, because they were like, you can take this pill, you can have this procedure. And in that moment, they wanted me to decide.
What'd you do? Did you decide then?
So I decided I was going to I did some type of supplement thing that they give you. So they said that because I was already bleeding, the pregnancy was already like the baby was coming out essentially.
Oh, so
like
you
the pregnancy loss.
You did the pill medicine, the Cytotec to help you.
Yes. And I didn't start that right away, but because I mean, after that we left the office, the bleeding started getting heavier and heavier. So because of that, I think I wasn't a candidate. Maybe I was, but for the other thing, like the DNC. Mm-hmm. And what is that?
So anytime that you have a miscarriage, you can, a first trimester, or I guess a second trimester miscarriage too, that you can do a medication called Cytotec to help open up the cervix a little bit and empty out the uterus. And then the other option is that you can do a procedure called a dilation curettage or a DNC. So it's basically suctioning everything out of the uterus. And there's no right or wrong answer. One is not better than the other with regards to, you know, future or harm. It's more of a preference thing. And there's some reasons when a doctor may recommend one over the other, depending on how far along you are or what your blood count is to start. But you have both of those options. And you had chosen the medication route, that cytotech route. Yeah.
I did. I personally didn't want a procedure, and I felt like things were already moving along. So I just said, we'll just keep going and see what happens. Because the way they described it, it felt like it would be, I wasn't trying to have, like I said, no procedures. I felt like it'd be like a period. I had experienced pretty bad cramps growing up. So I was like, okay, it'll be like a period. So
Yeah, let's talk about that because I remember I was at work. I was working labor and delivery on my nights rotation. I was a resident at the time. And on my nights rotation, I usually didn't get off till 7 in the morning. So my plan, you called me and told me all of this, and I was, not able to be there at the time. And mom wasn't even living in, our state. She was in California. So I was like, okay, when I get off of work, I'm going to come to your house, and then you were going to take the medicine when I came to your house. But it turned out that you didn't even need the medicine. Everything was starting before I even got there. So what was that like? What were you experiencing?
Well, before I went to work basically through the whole thing.
Oh my
So
gosh,
I went to,
I forgot
yeah,
that.
I did. I went to, maybe it was a Friday. It was a Friday. So I went to work on Friday because I think I found out on Thursday. So the next day I still went to work, and I was like, okay, put on a pad and see what happens. So I remember that day at work, I was working with children. I was working at a youth center, and I was the director of the youth center. And so I basically had to move around all over the place, talk to parents, talk to kids. I was in so much pain. I cannot believe I even made it through that. It was worse than a period. It was way worse. Like, I remember trying to sit down when I could because the pain would just come in waves, and it was so painful. It was like you had to sit down. That's how bad it was. And I was
It's like
gritting
little
through
contractions.
it. It was. I mean, now that I've experienced labor, it felt like labor. It really did. It wasn't the exact same sensations personally that I had, but it was definitely like a labor pains because it was the waves of pain like I had when I was in labor. Like, it came and went, and it was debilitating. So I was working through that. And I remember I had to drive home.
Oh
I
my
drove, and
gosh.
that was so hard. I was like, oh my gosh, why am I doing this? So when I finally get home, I felt like, okay, I could just lay down, but really nothing would help with the pain. Nothing helped with the pain. I tried a heating pad. I tried medication. And I remember, you probably remember me rolling around in pain on the bed.
Yeah.
It
Did
was
they
so painful.
prescribe you anything to help with the pain, or did you find anything that helped?
I think you might have maybe recommended that I get them to prescribe something, but I don't know. I feel like if they did, I would not have been in so much pain. But I did. So after things started progressing, I feel like it took a while for things to get to the peak of pain, which I think is like the peak of the baby, things being exited from my body. So it was just like a period where there's a lot of bleeding, and I was like so nervous. I'm like, so am I going to see it come out? I remember
Yeah.
asking you, like, am I going to see like a little baby? And you're like, no, it'll be like blood clots or something like that.
But that's a real fear that, anyone can have, that fear of what's happening. What am I going to expect? Am I going to see something that's going to make me uncomfortable? So, that's a whole part of it, not just the pain itself, but just the emotions that go with it and those
Mm-hmm.
fears.
Yeah, because it's really unknown. I mean, it's like you don't know what you're about to experience, what it's going to feel like, not only physically but emotionally. But when I was going through the physical pain, I really didn't have time to think about the emotional side of things because I just was getting through it. Just like when you're having a baby and you're in labor pains, you're just getting through the pain. So luckily, my now husband came over to hold my hand and to really be there with me. And I remember when the pain finally eased, I could watch TV, I could talk, but it was just like labor. Like, I could not talk, I could not do anything but focus on the pain. So after about, I would say like 12 hours, which seems like a long time now, but
Yeah.
like a solid 12 hours, the pain eased up. I did take the supplement. I actually didn't take it right away. So I took it when you came over, which was in the evening. So that was already like,
No, it was the morning.
oh, okay. So it was the next day.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So at that point, I think that was like 18 hours in. But I took it at that point because you recommended I take it for a reason. Because I didn't want to take it. I felt like it was going to make it even more painful. But why did you tell me I should take it?
Well, at the time, you weren't sure if what you experienced was what you were supposed to experience. You were like, I had bleeding, but I don't know if it was a lot of bleeding. I don't know if everything is past. And so, of course, now looking back, everything you just described, it definitely sounded like you passed everything, but at the time you weren't 100% sure. So to be on the safe side, we had talked about you just going ahead and taking it just to be sure.
So what if everything, like there's a possibility that everything could not pass for a woman?
No, yeah, because sometimes people can have bleeding and it's just a little bit, or it's lighter than it should be, and you may think that it's the miscarriage completely being over or past, but it may not be. And sometimes eventually you can get there and things pass, but sometimes it doesn't, and it can lead to infection, which can be, even get very serious. Or sometimes it doesn't, it's prolonged and you just like want it to be over. So the medicine can help to expedite that. Or in situations where you get diagnosed with a miscarriage based on ultrasound only and you're not having any bleeding, it could take quite a long time for the bleeding to actually start. So that medicine can help to kickstart that.
Okay. Well, for me, when I took that, I think I had already kind of gone through the worst of it physically.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, what I did at that point was just rest for the rest of the weekend and took it easy and just laid down and just tried to sleep. It was really, really tiring, just like mentally draining, physically draining. And then by Sunday, I was like, I want to get out. I want to like just act normal again. So I remember that we went to Panera and we were sitting down eating. Maybe, I don't know if it was exactly the Sunday, but then I started to get very emotional. So I remember seeing a baby there with like a family and their baby, and I started crying. We had to leave because I was like so sad. I was like, why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to us? We just wanted to have a family. And it started to sink in that of what just happened, and that, we're not having a baby anymore. And so that was when I started to think about, okay, great. Now I have to tell everyone I told that, oh, we're not having a baby anymore. And it all started to sink in, and I was like, let's just go back home. I don't want to be out here anymore.
So how do you feel like you navigated those feelings, and how long were you navigating those feelings, all the different feelings that you may have associated with the miscarriage?
Well, I mean, I feel like I was always optimistic that we would have a family one day. So that was one silver lining, was like, okay, maybe this wasn't the right time for us. I tried to stay optimistic of like, this wasn't the right time for us. There will be another time. We're going to have another baby. I felt confident that we would go on to have a family. And the sadness, I was just really grateful to have a partner, and then you, mom, to talk to. I mainly talked to Dontrell about it though, because we both were going through it together. So him and I would just spend time talking about how we feel. And he was really great about listening to me about it. And we also had just gotten engaged. So we had a lot of other distractions because we were planning a wedding. We had some other fun things to look forward to. So, I mean, honestly, I think what helped was that I told y'all we named the baby. And so we just started talking about baby like, like it was an experience, but we were like, we're religious and we're spiritual. So we felt very much like we'll see the baby again one day. And we really like held to faith and held on to each other, and also just stayed optimistic about the future. The hardest part was just reconciling like what like thinking about like telling people. For me, that was the hardest part. I didn't even tell it many people, but then having to go back again and say, we lost the baby, like that for me was kind of annoying.
Yeah. Now, what was hard about that? Would you say that it's like a feeling of having to talk about it or disappointing others? Like, what part of that is hard? And I ask that because I think a lot of women feel like that, feel like, oh, I don't have to tell people now that this thing happened. I even felt that when I had to delivered Russell early and have to talk about that. So, what are some of the feelings that you had that made you worried or hesitant about it?
I just didn't want to relive it again and think about it. I didn't want to answer questions. I didn't want to tell a story. And I didn't want people to say, I'm sorry. I don't know. I just felt like nothing they said would be okay. And just to trivialize it by saying, like, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. It just felt very, I just felt like it was an unnecessary truth that I had to confront. And I mean, honestly, I didn't even tell that many people, but I still didn't want to have to circle back and talk to them just because I didn't want to like face that conversation and hear what they had to say. And like I said, answer questions. And if they want to ask, I mean, usually people are pretty polite. They're not going to ask you questions. I know it's a pretty extreme and traumatic experience, but it was just the fact of having to relive it and rethink about it again. And it's just a very personal thing to share, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, you said that you were so grateful that you had Dontrell with you to kind of go through everything. And I know that people can grieve differently and go through things differently. Do you feel like he had his own experience with grieving, or did he show you how he was dealing with everything? And what was that like?
Yeah, I knew that he was affected by it because he was so sad. I mean, he cried right there with me when we first found out, but he was so optimistic. Like I said, he knew that there's children in our future and that we would be okay. So for us, grieving was talking about it, talking about how we felt and talking about kind of the loss that we feel. And that was his take on it. I think his primary focus was supporting me. I feel like he, more than anything, more than grieving and more than like experiencing his feelings, he primarily just wanted to make sure I was okay, because he was like, I remember him saying, I can't go through it, I can't experience what you're experiencing, I can't feel what you're feeling. And that made him feel very sad, just to see me in pain and sad and upset, because of course, as men, you can't do this. So he felt like he just wanted to take away my sadness and just be a listening ear for me. And I feel like that kind of overshadowed his grieving. But I know that he was sad because, we had conversations and he would tell me how he was feeling. But that having each other just really helped in its optimism about the future.
That's good. That's so
Yeah,
good.
I know.
Now, you mentioned that some things people said may not have been like the best thing to say. Not that they may mean well, but what are some things that may have been helpful to say to you or to somebody who's going through this? Like, what should people say in your opinion, or what you think might have been helpful?
I think that something that's helpful is just acknowledging the loss, just um, acknowledging it and really checking in on the woman and checking in on the mom mentally, physically. How are you doing today? How are you feeling? Um, Being a support person for the woman who's experienced the loss. And that can be very small things, probably. I mean, for me, would go a long way. A text message, um, just acknowledgement. I feel like it's so taboo. A lot of times people don't even want to act like it does not exist. Like you don't want to talk about it at all. But for the people who are aware, checking in, that makes a very big difference. And not like asking probing questions, but just saying, how are you doing today? How are you feeling? I was thinking about you today. Um, you don't even have to ask like anything deep, like just keep it high level, but just letting them know that you care and you're thinking about that person. That really does go far. And not
That's
just
good.
acting like it's something that doesn't exist, that didn't happen. And, oh, well, you'll do, and saying the wrong thing can be so big. Well, you'll have another baby one day, or it'll be okay. It's like that may or may not be true. So avoiding those common phrases that people say and actually keeping it real.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about advice you have for women who have gone through this before, like had a miscarriage, or, women who are nervous that this could be them? Like, what kind of advice would you have now that you've gone through it?
I think it's so important to, if you have experienced one or if you're fearful of experiencing one, be knowledgeable. Like, like what you've shared earlier today about the realities and actually the science of it, that's very important because I know some women who are just scared that it will happen, like me, just scared just because it's something that we're aware of. And I think just having those facts can be put you at ease. But also, I have two children now. So the optimism is so important because you can still have children. There is a future. And if it's not a child that you carry yourself, there are other ways to be a parent. So that optimism and the support system, it's so important to have at least one person that you know is a support for you and that's not going to ask those silly questions, but really will listen to you and be there for you, even if it's just to hold your hand or just to bring you some tea. But having a strong, at least one person that is there for you and having those facts and just being optimistic because, you know, we really could have gotten to a dark place. That could have been, I mean, it could have been hard to come back from that if I didn't have those things. That really could be a hard place to dig yourself out of because like I said, even with the next pregnancy, I was still nervous, but I think I just had faith that everything would be okay.
Yeah.
And even if it wasn't, I was like, well, we'll try again. And I know with some women, some women experience several miscarriages. And so I know for me, thank goodness it was just the one, but I mean, it can be really tough.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I think, you know, one thing I know could help a lot of women is just to be more vocal and not always telling your business, but just letting other women know that we're going through some of the same things together and we can support each other in that way. So I really think this is going to be helpful for a lot of women.
I hope so, because like you said, 1 in 4 women, which is a lot. That means if you think about the women that you might know 3 other women, that's 4. That means at least, you know, one of them may experience a miscarriage. So making yourself available to be there. I mean, it's so common. I actually wasn't even aware of those numbers. That feels really, really high. But when I think about my group of friends, it's pretty accurate.
Yeah.
So now let's get into a new segment that we're including for this week called Ask Dr. White, aka Renita. So this week, we feel like this is a great topic for Dr. White to answer questions based on commonly asked questions that she gets in her office around early pregnancy loss or miscarriage. So first question that maybe you've definitely heard before, why do some women have miscarriages and others don't?
You know, this is one of the toughest parts of it because there's no predicting why some women will have a miscarriage and some women won't. Now, there are some women who may have some risk factors that make it higher for you to have a higher chance for you to have a miscarriage, but that's not always so common. Those risk factors can be something on the inside of the uterus, like a polyp or a fibroid, or something called a septum that can lead to miscarriage or problems with implantation. But most of the time, it's usually going to be due to something going on with the DNA when egg and sperm meet. And if it's not viable, the body resets.
Got it. So are there different types of miscarriages, like different categories of them? Or like, I know you talked about what constitutes one, but is that a thing in the medical field where there's different types?
So usually you can think of it based on when you are having your miscarriage. Most of the time, women who experience miscarriage are going to have it in the first trimester and most likely when they're less than 10 weeks pregnant. So when people think of a miscarriage, they're usually thinking of that time range. But women who experience second trimester loss, like if you're, 16 weeks pregnant and your water breaks early and you've lost that baby, that in itself is a type of loss too. That's a type of miscarriage or loss of the pregnancy. Another kind of loss or miscarriage would be a chemical pregnancy. So sometimes it can be, people may say, oh, it's just a chemical pregnancy, nothing to worry, you weren't really pregnant, but that can be hard for a woman who's trying to get pregnant or who was excited about being pregnant. And when somebody's talking about a chemical pregnancy, it's where you have a positive pregnancy test maybe your period was late for a week or two, and then you start to bleed before you really see it on ultrasound and really get to confirm that pregnancy in that way. But that's a type of loss in itself too.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it's just so interesting because when you think about being pregnant and what you see on social media and when people talk about, it's all just the pleasantries of pregnancy. And this is such a non-talked about topic. I think more so nowadays people are more comfortable with women talking about what goes on with us, but the different types of pregnancy losses. I mean, that's kind of new information to me a little bit.
Yeah.
So I also was wondering about you know, thinking about my experience and some things I thought about, like after I had a miscarriage, I was like worried that it would impact future pregnancies or that it meant that I would have a hard time conceiving, like so much so that when I had my second child, well, my first child, Dallas, I was like so nervous the whole first trimester because I was scared that I was going to miscarry again. So I mean, to me, I was like, okay, I don't even want to get excited about this pregnancy yet because something can go wrong like last time. But is there any fact or any like actual, is it possible that your body can change or that having one miscarriage means that you're more likely to have more down the road?
Now, for most women, when you have a miscarriage, your chances of having a successful pregnancy after that miscarriage are a lot higher than your chances of having another miscarriage. But people can have more than one miscarriage. If you look at the rates of miscarriage, it's probably 1 in 4 women will have a miscarriage in their life.
Oh, wow.
But think about
That's
all the
pretty
women who
high.
have babies, you know what I'm saying? So, but it doesn't change how nerve-wracking it can be when you have that next pregnancy and you want to know how things were going, especially when you're around the time that you had a miscarriage the first time.
Are you more likely to have one, like, let's say you have like one or multiple, are you more likely to have it like the first time you get pregnant or does it really matter? There's no logic.
There's no logic. It can literally happen, at any time. Somebody can have like 4 kids and then have a miscarriage the 5th time. So there's really no logic to it for most women.
How soon after a woman has a miscarriage can she start trying to get pregnant again?
For a woman who has a first trimester miscarriage, there's really no need to wait beyond, finishing that miscarriage. So I tell people you'll have some bleeding related to the miscarriage. There'll be a period of time where you don't have bleeding. And then the next bleed that comes on, that's your period. So that lets you know that your body's basically reset, so to speak. You are ovulating again. You could go ahead and start trying. So if you plan on going ahead and trying to get pregnant again right after, just keep taking your prenatal vitamin.
Good to know. Yeah, for us, we got pregnant again and we weren't, again, it just kind of happened. We weren't trying, but it was about a year and a half later. And we were like, all right, we're ready again. So, so at that point, I still had normal periods, everything that I had, my body felt the same as before. And then, the pregnancy, I think every pregnancy is different as far as what you feel, the symptoms you experience. I did have different experiences that probably was not miscarriage related, but yeah, it happened 18 months later.
Yay.
Yay, Dally. How soon after a woman is pregnant should she tell people that she's pregnant? Is there a recommended time frame?
There is no recommended time frame. I think it's part of our society here in the US, at least, I don't know about other countries, that everyone tends to wait until after the first trimester. So the first trimester ends at 14 weeks. Most people wait till after 12 to 14 weeks, but it's not a medical recommendation to do that. I think it's because people are nervous about talking about miscarriage in case they have a miscarriage. And another reason for it is that a lot of people will do first trimester screening, which is a type of test that looks for any DNA issues like Down syndrome. And so many people feel more comfortable making sure that they make it through the first trimester and that they don't have any DNA issues before telling people that they're pregnant. That being said, it is okay to tell people whenever you are ready. That can be the minute you take that test and you find out you're pregnant, or it can be, when you have the baby. But there's no medical reason to not tell people. And I am hoping that the more people feel comfortable talking about things like miscarriage or like some of the complications that can come along with pregnancy, unfortunately, that we can talk about it all together and build more of a community around those who are struggling. And so people can feel more comfortable talking about being pregnant earlier so that if they go through a miscarriage, they can, get support from those that they may need it from.
That's right. There is no rule. Do what you want. So another common question that you're asked or a statement is, I'm told that I have a miscarriage, but I'm not bleeding. What's going on?
So I kind of mentioned this before, but a miscarriage can be diagnosed in one of two ways in the first trimester. You can either be having bleeding and it's like a period and you're starting to pass everything. And then ultimately, when you take a pregnancy test later, it's going to be negative. Or you may be diagnosed with a miscarriage at the time of an ultrasound, even though you're not bleeding, because either the pregnancy is not progressing how it's supposed to be, baby's not growing, or there's no heartbeat, or on the first ultrasound, you're way off on your dates, there's no heartbeat, or something's just completely obviously not how it's supposed to be. And so that is a very common way to be diagnosed these days because ultrasound is so commonly used. So it is possible to be told you have a miscarriage without actually having bleeding yet. And then there would be some options to help kind of deal with that.
Okay. And so what about when folks say I'm bleeding, but I'm told that the baby is fine? What's going on with that?
So as you had mentioned, it can be so nerve-wracking when you're having bleeding and you're like, oh my God, what's going on? Am I having a miscarriage? But there sometimes are other reasons for bleeding that is not actually a miscarriage. I've seen people have heavy bleeding and it's not a miscarriage. And, even I, in my pregnancy with Russell, bled for the first trimester and it was not a miscarriage. So, other causes of bleeding can sometimes be implantation bleeding in the beginning. Sometimes you may have something going on with your cervix that's leading to bleeding, some extra bleeding from the cervix, even though that's the bottom of the uterus, even though it has nothing to do with the pregnancy itself. There's also something called a subchorionic bleed, which is bleeding next to the pregnancy inside your uterus that actually isn't a miscarriage. So the most important thing I would say is anytime you're having bleeding, light or heavy, call your doctor to ask for guidance. And then make sure you ask, if it's not a miscarriage, what are the signs that are going to let me know that this could be a miscarriage and that I need to see you again?
Right. Yeah, I also had bleeding. I don't know if you'd call it bleeding. It was blood. I guess that's bleeding, but with one of my other pregnancies, and it was just, it was nothing. I don't know what it was, basically.
Yeah.
And then the last question, you may or may not get this, but I'm wondering, can you get time off for experiencing a miscarriage? Like, is there any policies that you're aware of, federal, state, for women who've experienced a miscarriage?
I wish that there were, but unfortunately, they're not, at least in our country. And I'm not sure about states. California may be one of those states that has a policy I don't know about. But, in the U.S., we really do not give time for women who are having a miscarriage, which is unfortunate and hard because, as you mentioned, you were at work basically having a miscarriage, and you know how tough that is.
Yes.
There are some countries who do have, laws that allow for that. If I'm not mistaken, I think like Finland or New Zealand, one of those countries recently changed their laws to allow for it. Don't quote me on that. But, it's very hard because women are expected to deal with it and get back to work or have to try to rush this in over the course of a weekend. And that's for the physical component of it, not the emotional. So things I try to do as a doctor, provider for women, I try my best to write a work excuse to say, please give a woman X amount of days off. I try to talk to women who have to take the medication to say, hey, let's find a time that you can make sure you have your support system around you. Or if you want to be alone or not around your kids, let's figure out a way to make this ideal for you. You had mentioned the procedure, the DNC, how it wasn't right for you, and that's definitely fine. That's perfectly fine. But some women choose the DNC procedure so they don't have to go through the long, drawn-out bleeding portion of it, and that they can just do the DNC, be done, and have a shorter recovery, so to speak. So because we don't have any laws and policies, I just try my best to write work excuse where I can. Some jobs take them, some jobs don't. And, try to talk about ways to make this a process as easy as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not going to be easy, but, try to help in that way.
Yeah, it really is. I wonder how common it is for women to just work through the miscarriage, not take any time off, especially if you may not get paid for that time off. For me, I was in a job where I felt like I had to be there every day. And I was really prioritizing everything else above myself, which is why I was like, I'm just going to work through the pain, take the weekend and go back on Monday and just act like nothing happened. I felt like I was not really prioritizing self-care back then. And I was like so adamant about my career and the work that I did. And maybe that was to my detriment, but I felt like, let me just keep going. I felt like it's just a thing that happens and I'm just going to keep moving and keep pushing forward. And I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's a right or wrong way to of how you react after you experience a miscarriage. But for me, I think at that stage in my life, I was like, I'm just going to keep going, just keep going. And the further I get away from this experience, the less raw I'll be about it. And the more I can just accept reality about what happened.
And you know what? You doing that is something that a lot of women do, not just because they want to, but sometimes they feel like they don't have a choice, especially because there's no system really in place to help women in the workforce or, in these situations to navigate that at a professional level. If you, tell your job, oh, I'm having a miscarriage right now, how are they going to react to that?
Right.
How are they, what's in play? People know, the systems that are in play for maternity leave. Okay, fill out this FMLA paperwork.
Right.
What's your short-term disability? But people really don't even know how to handle that component of things. And it's different than like being sick for the day. Oh, I have a cold. It's not like that.
Yeah.
If you were going to have surgery, it's like, okay, well, you're having surgery. Even if it's like wisdom teeth, they'll be like, okay, you have X amount of days off and come back at this time. But I just feel like there's nothing in place to help women who are having miscarriages. And because it's not really talked about, it's going to be harder to get something in place until we can be a little bit more vocal about it and, help women who are in those situations.
And plus, my job didn't even know I was pregnant. So I was planning on telling them when I got back to work in January and like as the year progressed, but I was like, they don't even know. How do I even broach this? And I was like, I could just lie and say that I'm sick. But also I was like, I just want to keep going. I felt like I mean, it's like when you're going through a sad depression or a sadness in your life, it's like, when does it end? I was like, if I stay home, I'm just going to lay here and be sad, or I can get back out there and continue living life. So I felt like those were the only two choices, was either to continue being sad or to keep on living. But I do think that probably if I had experienced a miscarriage, I pray that I don't, but if I went back in time, I would actually take some time just to process and to allow my body a time to heal. Cause I'm sure it's kind of probably traumatic on your body as well.
I mean, yeah, think about the pain and the bleeding you had. So not to mention any pregnancy symptoms somebody could be having at the same time. What if you had severe nausea and fatigue? I mean, all of it.
And then the hormones, they probably are decreasing at that point, and that could probably cause even more emotional distress.
And risk of depression. I mean, it's just a lot that can go along with it. And it doesn't mean that everyone has to be out for a long period of time. Like you said, some people may want to continue to work and continue that routine to feel their best self as much as they can in that situation. But if you need that time to grieve and if you need that time to heal or to heal emotionally and to actively bleed and hemorrhage at that time, then you should have that right. You should have that ability.
Yeah, totally. Is the DNC, is that covered by insurance? Like, would an insurance provider cover that?
Yeah, so it's a medically indicated procedure, meaning that insurance is supposed to cover it. But that being said, insurances are different. And I've seen some insurances be super, great about coverage and patients barely pay anything. And I've seen some where women are expected to pay a couple $1,000 for a procedure like that, which again is just horrific. But, That's a whole nother topic
my
about
gosh.
insurance in the U.S.
Yes, that just reminded me. I didn't have insurance when I was going through this.
Oh, yeah.
I did not have insurance. So I was even more scared. I said my now husband and I were boyfriend and girlfriend, and I had a job that didn't provide insurance. So instead of paying the $300 a month, I was like, well, I'm healthy. I'm in my 20s. I'm not going to get it. I mean, that was my reality back then. So that was another thing I had to consider. I went to like the public Department of Health to get even to find out I was pregnant. I was like, okay, where do I go? Planned Parenthood. I mean, that is a whole nother conversation because I had to figure it out with no insurance.
Yeah.
So thank you all for listening to this conversation today. We hope that this information has been helpful. And if you have experienced a pregnancy loss, an early pregnancy loss, or know a woman who has, it's okay to talk about it, and it's okay to be there for that woman. And we hope that you will consider sharing your experience, because it could help somebody else in your circle and your 1 in 4 women friends who may have experienced a miscarriage as well.
And if you're going through a miscarriage or have gone through one before, just know that this is a hard time, but you will get through it, and there's light on the other side. And there's lots of women out there who've gone through it, and we are strong as women. We've got you.
Right. Thank you for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss a thing. And leave us a review. You can also follow us on Instagram at The Cradle and All, or email us at thecradleandall@gmail.com.